Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. So welcome back, everybody. This is a story that starts in a very small, very crowded side room at the Internet Engineering Task Force meeting 124 in Montreal. Happened fairly recently. So picture this. You've got a gathering of browser architects, policy specialists, working group chairs, privacy researchers, content creators, and a handful of curious observers who just care about where the web is headed. And the session was titled Preserving the Open Web. It was convened by Mark Nottingham and David Ashkenazi, two people worth following, by the way, if you want a sense of how the technical and policy worlds are trying to make sense of the internet's future. And a week later, at the W3C TPAC meeting, which is another standards meeting, it happens annually. This time it happened in Kobe, Japan. I found myself in almost exactly the same conversation. It was convened again by Mark and David. They were trying to get sort of the different perspectives across different standards organizations. And they were, asking the same question. And the only difference was we had a slightly larger room, which was nice, and therefore a different set of people, new faces, different cultural norms, and a different governance style for the standards organizations. But in both meetings, we landed almost immediately on the same question: what exactly are we trying to preserve when we talk about, quote unquote, the open web? For that matter, what is the open web? I mean, the phrase is everywhere. It shows up in policy documents, in standards charters, in opening keynotes, in hallway conversations. I mean, everybody uses it. But sit a group down and ask them to define it, and things get very fuzzy very quickly. And that fuzziness isn't just like an academic nuisance. It does matter. And in Montreal and again in Kobe, it proved to be a very practical obstacle, because as new specifications are being written, we're seeing automation patterns shifting, we're seeing economic pressures changing, and without clarity about what open means, identifying the problem that we're trying to solve becomes harder. Now, we initially were talking about this as if this was like a new thing, but it's not. The web has been wrestling with the meaning of open for literally for decades. If you rewind to the earliest days of the web, everything about it was profoundly human-scaled, right? People actually wrote HTML by hand. They published it to servers that they controlled. They linked to one another. Publishing required no permission. Reading was unrestricted. You didn't need an account. You didn't need to share your identity. You didn't need a subscription. You kind of just needed computer and internet access. You could build a new tool or host a new site simply because you had an idea and the ability to type and the computer and connection to do it. If you go to the Web Foundation's history of the web, it describes those early design choices as a deliberate act of democratization. Tim Berners-Lee wanted anyone to be able to create, anyone to be able to link, and anyone to be able to read using the tools of their choosing. And that was the earliest spirit of the open web, that humans publish, humans read, and everything else stays out of the way. Dun, dun, dun. Then the robots arrived. So in 1994, Martin Koster proposed a very simple file called robots.txt that would tell automated crawlers, which were becoming a very big deal, where they were and were not welcome. That wasn't a law. I mean, there was no regulation behind that. It wasn't enforced by any particular legal construct. It was a social protocol. Well-behaved crawlers read it and respected it. Bad actors ignored it and exposed themselves by doing so. So that tiny little file introduced a very important shift in that it acknowledged that openness for humans did not automatically mean openness for machines. So even then, openness had some nuance to it. So that was an interesting history, and that history does keep resurfacing. So when I was researching for this particular post, one of the earliest pieces I found that really tried to define the open web came from a gentleman named Tomtek in 2010. He wrote a post. All these links are actually in the written blog, and his post was, "What is the open web?" And his framing wasn't about purity tests or ideological litmus strips. It was about characteristics that anyone can publish, anyone can read, anyone can build tools, anyone can link, And interoperability creates more value than enclosure. It's kind of amazing, I mean, how relevant that still feels 15 years later, and just to be clear, he was in the room again at TPAC as we were having this conversation. Can't imagine what was going through his head of, "Oh my god, again? We're talking about this again? Still?" When you come down to it, right, the web has always needed recalibration. It's always been shaped by the communities negotiating and renegotiating what matters as the technology evolves around them. As the innovation opens new possibilities, the expectations shift. And so does the need to revisit what open should actually mean in today's world. And so automation, AI, has pushed us to the next round of that negotiation. So today's successors to robots.txt are emerging in the IETF. One of them is called the AI Preferences Working Group, commonly known as AI Pref. They're working on creating a structured way for websites to express their preferences about AI training and automated data reuse. They're trying to like actually come up with the language that would go in something like a robots.txt file. So it's the same spirit. Here's what we intend, please respect it, but on a much larger at this point and more consequential scale. Now, why does that matter, right? Search crawlers, the thing that inspired robots.txt in the first place, they indexed the web so that humans could find things. That's what they did, that's what they do. AI crawlers are different in that they ingest the web so that their models can absorb things. That makes the stakes very different in terms of legal, economic, creative, and infrastructural possibilities. So there's another effort in the IETF called the WebBot Auth Working Group, which is trying to figure out whether bots should authenticate themselves, and if so, how. And first, they've had a couple meetings, but those meetings were trying to figure out what they wanted to be when they grew up, which is a fancy way of saying what should it be in our charter, things like that. So IETF 124 was their very first meeting, and it made it very clear just how tangled the space is. Are there quote unquote good bots and bad bots? Should we distinguish between them? If so, how? What characteristics even matter? And does authentication help, or does it shift the problem somewhere else? There are several hundred people in that room when we were having this working group meeting, and the debate got heated enough that the chairs wondered publicly whether the group had been chartered before there was enough consensus to even start. You could possibly call that a failure of the process. You could also say that it's a sign of something much deeper, and that's that we just don't share a mental model of what open should mean in a web increasingly mediated by automated agents. A link to the meeting minutes is in the written blog, and if you can actually find the video recording if you just want to see it happen in all its fabulous glory. In any case, that same lack of clarity about that lack of a mental model surfaced again in Kobe at the TPAC meeting. Now, that TPAC discussion started with the sentiment that anyone who's been on the web for a while will recognize. And that is that one of the web's greatest gifts is that it democratized information. It made learning, publishing, and discovery available to anyone with a computer and internet access. But then people were asking, is that actually still the reality we live in today? Because a lot has changed. There's paywalls, there's subscription bundles, there's identity gates, there's regional restrictions, there's content mediation, and now there's AI agents that read but don't attribute and they don't compensate. Some sites that were once built for people now serve data brokers. Others try and block AI crawlers outright. Economic pressures are very much shifting, as are the incentives, and not always in ways that align with the early ideals of openness. And from there, of course, we had to dig deeper into all of that. And I think one of the most useful insights from TPAC was that open web isn't a switch. It's not a binary thing. It's not you're open or you're not. It's a spectrum, right? It happens in different dimensions. Price is one dimension. Did you have to pay for it? Yes or no? Friction is another. Did you have to jump through some kind of registration hoop to get there from here? Format, accessibility, identity requirements, device compatibility, geography, they all matter. If you move an article behind a paywall, that changes its openness along one axis, but not along all of them. Requiring an email address adds friction, but it doesn't automatically mean that the content is closed. So if you try and think of the open web as a binary, that's never really reflected reality, and it's no wonder we can't reach consensus if we keep trying to squeeze a multidimensional ecosystem into a yes or no box. Seeing openness as a spectrum makes room for the nuance that we really need to have, and it explains why agreement is so hard and maybe not actually necessary. That's an interesting thing if you think that further. So, another thread that resonated very deeply was the reminder that people publish for many different reasons. I mean, it's one thing to consume it, but there's also the people that looking at it from the perspective of publishers. Some people publish for reputational purposes. Goodness knows that's what I do. Some publish for a community endeavor. Some publish to make money. Some publish for the sheer joy of sharing knowledge. I do that too. And these motivations shape how people feel about openness. But AI complicates this because when readers experience your work only through an AI summary, the context that you cared about, the framing, the nuance, the emotional tone, may very well be gone. A piece written to persuade or provoke thought may be reduced to kind of a neutral paragraph that has nothing of your tone in it and nothing of your thought leadership. A tutorial written for your community may be absorbed into a model with no link back to you. And that's not just an economic problem, it's also like a meaning problem, and it changes how people think about what is open. So someone at TPAC brought up Eleanor Ostrom's work on how communities govern shared resources. One of her core principles is that these shared resources that you can call commons needs boundaries, not a restrictive barrier, but a clear expectation about how what is in the commons is, going to be used. That framing really clicked with a lot of people, I think. It helped reconcile that tension that we've all been feeling for many years, the tension of promoting openness while still acknowledging limits. The web has never been completely without boundary. It worked because we had shared norms, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, that made sustainable use possible. The AI pref and WebBot auth groups aren't restrictions on openness. I think they're attempts to articulate those boundaries for a new era, for the current state of what the commons are. But the hard part, of course, is agreeing about what those boundaries should be. Alas, one of the more uncomfortable truths in all of this is that when you're trying to figure out what's the scale of the problem you're trying to solve, you need to measure it. But we don't have good measurements because we don't know what we're measuring because we don't know how to define open. We don't have a shared way to quantify how open the web is today. We don't know how often automated agents actually obey directives. We don't know how often they reuse data in ways that publishers didn't intend. And we don't know how content accessibility shifts across devices and regions. There's a lot of data out there. If you go to Chrome's Crux dataset, Cloudflare's Radar, Common Crawl, they each offer pieces of the puzzle, but there's no coherent measurement framework, and that makes it really hard to know whether openness is expanding, shrinking, or changing shape. So without data, we're arguing from instinct, from anecdotes, and that's not enough to actually make good decisions at the scale we're trying to influence. But wait, there's more. Another candid realization from TPAC was that the standards bodies cannot mandate behavior here. They cannot force AI crawlers to respect preferences. They can't dictate business models. They can't control browser design, and they can't enforce clients to behave predictably. What the governance of the open web, looking like, for example, to robots.txt, has always been voluntary and has always been distributed and built on negotiation rather than coercion. The best contribution standards bodies can make here is not to pick a single answer, but to design systems where trade-offs are visible and where different actors can negotiate without breaking interoperability, which is not necessarily glamorous work, but it's the work we've got in front of us. Now, given the diversity of motivations and architectures involved, a single definition of open web is highly unlikely. But the conversations in both Montreal and Kobe suggested that we might at least align on values. And here were some of the values that kept surfacing across both conversations. That access being one, not that it should be unlimited, but that it should be meaningful, which is its own interesting question. Attribution, not only for legality, but to preserve the creator-audience relationship. Consent, because creators need way to express the boundaries in an ecosystem shaped by automation, and continuity so that the web remains socially, economically, and technically sustainable. Now, interestingly enough, these values echo exactly what Tomtec was framing back in 2010. They echo the Web Foundation's historical narrative, and they echo the open stand principles for open standards development. So, not definitions, They're guideposts and principles, and maybe that's what we need, which is good because I think that's as far as we can go with it. So this is why I think that preserving the open web isn't quite the right phrase we should be using. Preservation implies keeping something unchanged, but the web has never been static. It's always evolved through tension, right? Tensions between innovation and stability, openness and control, humans and automation, altruism and economic pressure. I mean, I think the Web Foundation's history makes this pretty clear, and so do the last 30 years of lived experience. 30 years. Good gravy. Has it really been that long? Has been for me. But anyway, the web endured because communities kept adapting to it. It grew because people kept showing up to argue, refine, and rebuild. And the conversations in Montreal and Kobe fit squarely into that tradition. So maybe the goal isn't preservation, maybe it's stewardship. Because stewardship acknowledges that the web serves many purposes, it acknowledges that no single actor controls it, and it acknowledges that openness requires boundaries, and boundaries require negotiation. Trade-offs here are not failures. They're just part of the ecosystem and what we have to do. Now, I think Mark and David's side meetings existed because people still care enough to do this work. The contentious WebBot off meeting wasn't the setback that it may immediately appear to be. It was kind of a reminder that the hard conversations are the ones that matter. And the TPAC discussion showed that even without agreement, we're still trying to understand what comes next. And if that itself isn't evidence that the open web still exists, I'm not really sure what is. So, this conversation is to be continued, right? The question of the open web has been underway for a very long time. You can say it started with the conversations that led to robots.txt in 1994. It showed up in 2010 in context writing. It's showing up now in the heated debates at standards meetings. And it's almost certainly going to show up again because the real work isn't in defining that term. It's in articulating what we actually value, the access, the attribution, the consent, the continuity, and making sure the tools and standards we build reflect our values. If the conversations in Montreal and Kobe are any indication, people do still care. They still show up, they still argue and revise and rebuild. And maybe that, more than anything else, is what's going to keep the web open. Thanks for your time. Drop into the written post if you're looking for any of the links that I might have mentioned today. And see you again next week. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.